I want to turn to an issue that's already been alluded to earlier, and that is Singapore is a multi-religious society, but the government has repeatedly emphasized that Singapore is also a secular state. So I want to put this question to the Minister. What does the government mean when it describes Singapore as a secular state? There are varieties of secularism. So how does the Singapore government understand this concept, and how does it use this term in relation to Singapore and in relation to governance?
Well, I guess the main thing really is that we separate religion from politics. But I would also have to say that I think it's difficult to, like earlier we talked about policies. I mean, then sharing views about the casino and not agreeing with it, does it constitute political interference or not? And I think, unfortunately, in the real world, and we all know, the black and whites are the easy things to define. But often, I think it's really the grey space. And I think it's great. It's not always easy to divorce the two. If we want Singaporeans to participate, whether as just individuals or as a Christian body and so on, I think you will share views which will have an impact on policies. And I think that's fine. The question, I guess, really is then, do you use the institution or the vehicle of religion to mobilize? Let's say if you, at the pulpit, and say that this is a wrong policy and I think we should organize ourselves and you actively canvass and encourage individuals perhaps to rally round and to take active positions against. But I think we all kind of understand that. But as Christians, I'm sure, and in history you see in other countries, there will be Christians who make a stand when they feel that they need to make a stand. And as all of you know, even as Christians, we have different definitions of where the lines are drawn. Some will be very militant, and we see that on some issues. Right? Say on LGBT issues, I'm sure even in this room, I hazard to guess there will be a wide spectrum of views.
Brace yourself.
Yeah, I'm bracing myself. So that's why I'm preempting it. So some of us will draw the line. This is not acceptable, and we will take this position. And I guess as individuals and as a church body, you choose to take that position. But as a secular nation, we then have to decide, does that begin to encroach into a space which we feel that actually this is not edifying as for a society? It actually ends up creating, because you see, we don't exist on our own. You create a pushback. And that's always the thing that comes in. And the dynamics, when it begins to unfold, takes on a life of its own. And that's when it becomes problematic. And that's when we feel that I think it will begin to encroach in our political space, and it encroaches on the well-being, because I think it makes it a lot more difficult. And especially in today's world where so many things are circulating, true or otherwise, and it gets so emotive. We look at our own reaction when we read a headline. Many of us don't read anymore. We see the headline and we get angry. But actually we don't. No, it's true, right? Or even when you read, and do we discern? But you can imagine how easy it is on issues that's so fundamental like religion and race, and then we begin to say things, and then by the time you realize that perhaps that was actually not really what was the issue at hand, emotions have been unfurled, words have been said, individuals who are a bit more susceptible might have gone a bit further, and you never know where it's going to go. And that's where you've got to figure out where those lines, there are certain hard lines ought to be drawn. But I think you do need to not define it so clearly, because the real world doesn't exist that way. You provide markers, and as each issue evolves, I think we are also learning how to define this, how far you go, where the balance ought to be struck. And balance isn't about 50-50. Sometimes balance is 60-40, but it has a balance of its own. Because if we start totaling, what is that? How come that religion can do all these things? I cannot. No, we may start tabulating. It is not even, because things have evolved in particular ways. How come Sikhs are allowed to wear turbans? How come we all are not? There's no particular intellectual reason how to justify this and that, but some things have evolved, and you agree to disagree, and that's the common space. And that's where we want to maintain, and as we evolve, hopefully in a comfortable way. But when I think religion or individuals begin to use the platforms and begin to start pushing and encroaching in that space, I think that's when it becomes problematic. I think we have had very few reasons to exercise some of the laws that we had in place, because we have mechanisms where we stepped in, we intervened, and there were near misses where there were serious considerations about certain actions being taken, but we were able to diffuse it. And that's because I think we take it seriously. You know, when we pay attention to race and religion, it's not because we don't have confidence in we as one united people, multiracial people. It's us recognizing the realities of religion and race, which I think, my personal view, is very primordial. It doesn't take much for it to resurface. But because it's so precious, we do need to work at it, create whatever vehicles we have, so that we can, when issues arise, we can diffuse it, so it never needs to get there.
I think this brings us very naturally to the only specific legislation, I think, that Singapore has passed on interfaith relations. And of course, I'm referring to the 1990 Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act, which defines the relationship between religion and politics in a way that is, I think, should be acceptable to many Christians. But there is a sense also that there is a lot of ambiguity in the wording of the Act. And it is in these ambiguous phrasings that I think the problem lies. So let me give you a hypothetical example. For example, if Singapore were to legalize euthanasia, right? And supposing a pastor preaches during a Sunday sermon against this policy where euthanasia is legalized, believing that euthanasia violates the sanctity and the value of human life, which the Bible and the Christian tradition uphold, the pastor's action could easily be construed as mixing religion with politics, or using religion to advance a certain political ideology. In other words, because the wording of the Act is so ambiguous, Christian witness itself can become very easily politicized, right? So do you agree that perhaps more dialogue, more conversation is needed to talk about the relationship between religion and politics, that the Act itself may not be sufficient?
I think it would be naive to believe that one act would, just like in Lord of the Rings, one ring that rules them all. There's one law, and therefore, because you have that law, therefore we are all harmonious. And no, it's not going to happen that way. I think it was enacted because we felt there was a need to at least put forward some legislation where you have the wherewithal without resorting to Sedition Act and so on. So you have a graduated, basically I think in laws, you always want to have a graduated series of options before you go and have a nuclear option. So you do have a range of actions that you can take without triggering something perhaps far more serious. But the laws in itself, like I said, I'm not sure, I'm sure there are a lot of experts, and I'm sure the community played a very big part in shaping it. And I'm sure the views were also articulated then as to whether one should be clearer or not. But as a non-legal person, I'm not always sure you can always define everything, because we would all like to be very clear about where the boundaries are, define it clearly so we don't overstep. But like I said, the real world unfortunately doesn't operate that way. And to actually even define that, I think that can become quite divisive. So do you then establish broader boundaries, but at least you articulate where they are? Yes, one could argue that it's not always definitive, but then that allows you some space for discretion, where I don't need to then, I cross that line, I trigger, I execute and take certain actions. But it allows me then to exercise some degree of judgment, because sometimes the context is very different in which one particular, so if you use that hypothetical example, euthanasia, there are issues today which I'm sure violate some of our fundamental beliefs for some. Abortion is just one example. So what do? We have abortion in Singapore.
It's safer to use a hypothetical example.
Yes, it's safer. But no, so let's call a spade a spade. So you have abortion, and I earlier mentioned about casinos, you have prostitution. I'm sure some of you have your individual positions on that. I'm sure some pastors will preach at the pulpit about what your church's position on that may be. Is it right? Is it wrong? My sense is that if you feel that it violates some of Christian teachings and say that as a church, that's something that we believe, but as a state, that's the reason for them wanting to do this, that, and the other, then. But it's very different perhaps when you say that, look, let's activate, let's mobilize, let's actively go against. And that's where it becomes a slippery slope, because where does it stop? Because we all have different definitions of our values. And you just take the case of some of the Islamic extremists, which I don't believe represents the Islamic community at all, but they are saying that this is my belief and I don't accept it this way, and therefore I resort to violence to execute that. And you also have Christian extremists in the United States who take certain actions as well. So there will have to be some natural boundaries, but I think the laws have to be buttressed by, I think, some of the structures were put in place where the dialogues are taking place actively with the churches, with the different religious organizations to build up the trust and the relationship. Because I think a lot of it is about engagement. The more you interact with each other, you begin to understand and respect each other, and you don't second guess. And basically you want to minimize uncertainty. And I think that allows, and that space for discourse allows us to then implement the laws, I think, in a sensible way. And I think that's how we've been trying to evolve it.
Religious extremism, extremist violence are serious threats, serious problems that no faith community here in Singapore can ignore. It is the responsibility of every faith community, indeed of every person who lives and works here in Singapore, to be vigilant and to help to keep our society safe. So, Minister, what are some of the ways in which different faith communities, especially the Christian community, can contribute to the safety and security of our nation? What roles can religious communities here play to address sectarianism and extremist ideologies?
My personal view about terrorism in Singapore is that it's a question of when and not if. And I think we should operate on the basis. Terrorism isn't going to destroy our country. It will hurt us physically, psychologically, emotionally. I think there will be some level of scarring, but you will deal with it and you will recover. But the strains that I personally feel that we ought to be most concerned about would be on our own social fabric as a multi-religious, multicultural country. Assuming that, and of course what is sort of vogue now, you have some of the Islamic extremists, and the thing is that it's not imported terrorists, it's moved past that. It's self-radicalization. And you will have perhaps individuals, and of course we had that individuals, Singaporean Chinese who naturalized citizen who wanted to fight against ISIS. So so it's quite equal opportunity. So I guess theoretically you could have all sorts of people being radicalized. But you could imagine that when it takes a religious tone because of the backgrounds of certain individuals, and when certain acts are exercised in the name of certain faiths, probably wrongly so, you can imagine the strains that it can create. So my sense is that our role really, as a Christian community, and I think as Singaporeans, is really to not take multi-religious, multicultural aspect for granted, to reinforce our understanding of the various faiths, to build up bonds across the different communities. I'll tell you that I think there's not as much interaction as we would like, simply because we move around in different circles, whether by education, work, but we do need to actively think about how do we try to bridge those gaps. Even though it may seem artificial, or we come together for IRCC, those kinds, but now it provides a platform for us to at least meet when we actually don't even necessarily meet. But when you begin to build up those ties and begin to at least establish mutual understanding, that's the thing that's going to kick in, I think, when the strains are felt. And then individuals will step up and say, no, this is not reflective, and I make a stand, and whether as a body or as an individual. And you want more of the people to have that, so that it crowd out the space of the extreme elements who will choose to play these games. And there will be those. Some are just complete idiots, but it exists. But they choose to in the name of anonymity and so on, but they may not always realize what they're actively fanning. And we don't exist on our own because there are a lot of pressures that comes from the region as well. So I think what we can do is actually, I guess, to promote greater understanding when issues occur, talk about them, understand the context. And I think a lot of it is not just a theoretical espousing of this multicultural, multi-religious, but actually to begin to establish bonds as much as we can with the people around us. So it's not just us understanding them, but they also beginning to understand our positions, so that when the strains come, we don't aggravate it, because it will be aggravated and there will be individuals swept along. But what we want to minimize is fewer individuals being swept along, so you lower the probability of these fissures, really taking place and pulling us apart. And I would say that that's, I guess, my personal biggest concern. I actually have a great deal of confidence in who we are. People always ask me at dialogues, I think we should stop having this CMIOs, Chinese, Malay, and take away the race, let's be colorblind, we are one people. No, the truth of the matter is not because we want to artificially recognize or we lack confidence, but I think that if we're not careful, and we see that in history, how easy it is for these issues to rear its head. And I think by protecting that space, it's our way of saying that, look, this is important. Yes, we would all like to be one people, and we are, but I think we need to continually just work at it and not take it for granted. I think some will have views that perhaps we should be a lot more matured and perhaps break some of these boundaries. But we don't think that that's necessarily the wisest way. We may be able to have this dialogue here quite openly, talking about these issues without getting too emotionally worked up. But once you put that discourse out in particular platforms, and you can see it for yourself, how it very rapidly escalates in directions which the moderate individuals begin to be afraid to speak up, because it's the extreme elements that will rear its head. But that's something that I think as a community we should try to inoculate ourselves, so that when things happen, we will be in a good position to deal with it.
Well, the time has come to extend this conversation to the audience.
I just wanted to find out Bishop's views from a Christian point of view. We heard from the minister with regards to what is secularism in a multi-religious society. But as a Christian and from a biblical worldview, what does that look like? And to Minister, just taking off from what you said earlier about how moderate Christians may be afraid to speak up, I think these days we are noticing that there are more Christian voices. I think when we do want to speak up, and if it's found out that we are Christian, already that gets discredited. And of course the media sometimes does not play in our favor if they vilify the voice because it happens to come from a Christian. Yeah, so how could you just comment or speak into that scenario? Excellent question. Bishop and then Minister.
Okay.
It gives me time to think.
So, we are a secular state, which means that our governance is neutral to all religions. Our decisions are rational and can be communicated in a common language. So that's a secular state. But I think it's wonderful that Singapore is a model, that the secular state does not mean a secular society, because the society is multicultural and in that sense multi-religious. So my reading is that the state, the government, accepts religious views into public discourse. But it has made a commitment that it won't be swayed by a religious argument. It will accept your views, but it will weigh it in terms of the common good. So it doesn't give dominance to any religious tradition, which marks us out, say, from Iran and so forth. So we have, I believe, my friends, something to be grateful for and something to ask God for the skill to be faithful in. And that is, we have a space in which we are expected to be responsible in how we communicate our views. I think Roland alluded to it, that sometimes it's perceived as being politicized, that you have a political agenda, that you have some reason for wanting to be a hero in the public space. So I think what is needed for us to fulfill the opportunity is trust. And trust takes time to build. It happens also in everyday life. If you are to receive critical appraisal from your staff, chances are you are open if the staff has demonstrated a loyalty to common goals. But if it's a new staff and new kid on the block and just focusing on one issue, etc., it does then color the interpretation. So the maintenance of religious harmony, personally I feel it's good that we don't try to detail it too much, because life requires a margin of interpretation where you have to see things in context. So a church that is fully committed to the care of its neighborhood, that takes a position on euthanasia but offers it up to the public space, may not be seen as politicizing a particular view on a policy. It may be seen as being responsible. I think it's also important to say that when Christians share their view, we're not intending to monopolize the public arena, as is sometimes portrayed. I'm beginning to address, I think, some things that you're asking, Minister. So if I can share an example which encourages me tremendously. We made our views known on the casino. We were not for the casino, but for other reasons, government decided to go ahead. However, some Christians were invited to be on the casino regulatory board. And it was a real question for them, what is my duty under God? Because I'm committed to this society, government has made a decision against my advice, but that does not cut off my ongoing responsibility. So we have some very fine Christians on the Casino Regulatory Board, and at least two of them worked hard to encourage foreign workers to exercise self-exclusion. They're just different ways in which we continue. So we accept the policy. So as we think of this secular society, we're not trying to monopolize, but we have a humble boldness to speak forth, to share our worldview, and then we don't overextend our role, because finally government makes the decision. But after the decision, we continue to display the responsibility. So that's how I understand secular versus, if you like, a hardened secularism. A hardened secularism, there's no way we're going to allow any religious voice into the public space. But that's not Singapore as I understand it.
And I think we'll lose something in the process if that's the kind of society we become. But maybe if I respond to the point about what happens when we speak up, and I guess sometimes, and I guess usually social media, I suppose, sometimes mainstream media is, then this person's Christian. Then people start jumping on the bandwagon, and that's why he's... And I think it applies to us as well. I mean, I am not shy about my faith. I mean, it doesn't mean I'm perfect. I have my own inadequacies, as with, I guess, others as well. But I do share sometimes on my Facebook, and now if there's a verse that I think makes sense, I will share it. I don't feel I should be shy about it. But I get people posting and say, is he, he's proselytizing. Well, I mean, I share verses from Gandhi also, so what does it mean? But these are people who will choose, and we know the agenda for some. And there's been one particular critic who has an online site, which online site is manning now, who pointed out, I'm quoting the Bible because of this, that, the other. Well, and there'll be those. And in my position in MSF, and for example, the positions that we take on, because some of it are very values-laden, whether it's unwed moms, whether it's LGBT issue, family, how do you define a normal family unit? And then, he's Christian, so that's why like that. I'm sure. I mean, it's a matter of time. It's going to come up at some point when these issues are brought to the fore. But I am very sure that there will be in the groups that will play that up. But I don't think we should be shy about who we are and what we believe in. We articulate our views, and if others choose to mock and make an issue of our own faiths, and that's why, well, that's our faith and that's what we believe and that's who we are. But I don't think the majority of people are like that, actually. The only thing is that that's why they're called the silent majority. They don't speak up. And you find, especially on social discourse and the space on social media, it tends to be the vocal element. And to be fair, it's not just that. The other end, we also have, I think, quite right-wing believers as well who hold very strong views. But we do also see more people speaking up and moderating that space. But I guess that's the nature of the community that we live in. The dynamics are like that. Social media space particularly tends to be populated in particular ways. Conversations do tend to gravitate in certain directions. And this is where, when you're at the receiving end of it, you know exactly how it feels. I mean, people always tell me, don't read lah, no, don't ignore this. Yeah, very easy to say lah, because you're not at the receiving end. But when you're on the receiving end, it hurts, and you feel it. And I think some of you, perhaps the lady with her own personal example, when you share, you find people comment, that's how it is. But that's bullying. That's actually an act of terrorizing someone to not speak up. And I think we shouldn't be afraid to. But it's something that I think we have to learn to accept, that unfortunately, that's the space that's there.